So as I'm sitting here hitting F5, refreshing my page, hoping to catch the SNES Classic on pre-order, I think the big question on my mind is, what has Nintendo learned after their whole experience releasing the NES Classic last year? Or I guess maybe some would say debacle. Let's start the show. So let's get this straight right off the bat. The NES Classic Mini was not a failure. Nintendo has always sold consoles at a profit. And what that means is that unlike Microsoft and Sony, they don't sell their system at a loss, waiting to eventually make up the money in software sales. It's always been like this ever since I started buying Nintendo products. And Nintendo has always been a very conservative company, which also means you won't see a lot of Nintendo products sitting on shelves collecting dust. Except for maybe those Animal Crossing amiibos. Yeesh, what was up with that? So basically what I'm saying is that it's not like Nintendo lost money on all this. They sold a bunch of those little mini systems, either 2.3 or 2.7 million if I'm not mistaken. And they made money starting from the first one they sold. So let's not talk about the mini NES like it's some sort of virtual boy. I know there are a lot of people who are sour about how things went down. But if you'll humor me, I'll tell you a little bit about how I feel you should see the situation. And also why I see hope at the end of the tunnel. So I think the big thing Nintendo learned from their misread of the situation last year is yes, there absolutely is a market for these retro games. I know it might seem obvious now, but I remember last year when they announced the little throwback console, a lot of people poo-pooing on it, talking about how it was overpriced, you could get the games on Virtual Console already, how you're essentially having to pay for games that you don't want. And that was the scenario for me. I didn't buy one day one because either A, I already owned the game, either on Virtual Console or the original cartridge. B, if I wanted a game, I would just go buy it on Virtual Console. And C, I didn't see a point of buying another console to have to plug in, especially if it wasn't going to be an end-all, be-all NES machine. And so I think that was the case with a lot of video game fans. And I think Nintendo must have heard a lot of the negativity with all these people coming out and saying, fuck you, Nintendo, fuck you up your stupid asses. I'm not buying your overpriced piece of shit console. And they were like, whoa, 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 I guess we should play this safe. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what happened, but that's logically how I would have handled the situation. Make the announcement, measure consumer interest, and produce accordingly. Now, the problem was when this thing came out, it suddenly became a collector's item. What was targeted at casuals, suddenly all these Nintendo fans wanted it too, even though they could just go buy the games off of Virtual Console. Could anybody have predicted this? If you say that back in July of last year, you could have predicted the NES Classic situation, then congratulations, you need to be working at a major company. Because I don't think anybody had high hopes for that. And you have to remember that a lot of these games that were featured on the system weren't specifically Nintendo published. Which means I'm sure they had to work out some sort of licensing agreement with the individual publishers. And as we know, licensing agreements are always a pain in the ass. So when it rolled around time that the NES Classic was an obvious success, I think the agreements had been made, the licensing agreements had been set, and it wasn't like you could suddenly go back and renegotiate everything and start over. I assumed that a licensing agreement would run something like, hey, you give me X amount of dollars and I'll let you produce Y amount of games with our intellectual property. Because I'm sure it's not like Nintendo paid a flat fee and can just keep on churning out copies as much as they want. So then why didn't Nintendo just go ahead and make a new contract and keep on producing NES Classics? Well, because they don't actually want to sell you NES Classics. You have to remember that these things were $60. With 30 games, that adds up to about $2 a game. And then you have to include the cost of manufacture, parts, components. It's a lot of work when you can just go sell the game on Virtual Console for almost straight up profit. So why did they do it? Well, it was a placeholder product. Nintendo's done this in the past, where they've released an item for sale during the holidays to tide them over till their next big thing. Anybody remember the Game Boy Micro? This was kind of the same thing. A product that didn't really sit well in Nintendo's long-term goals. Long-term, Nintendo wants to sell you a Switch. They want you to buy their shiny new system that will eventually have the Virtual Console and all these NES games anyways. But last year, for the holiday season, this was something for people to buy, and it made sense at the time being. And I think it's the same going for this holiday season. By the time the holidays roll around, I'll assume Nintendo will have some sort of online offering set up. This includes the Virtual Console. But as has been in the past, they've historically rolled out the Virtual Console in waves, starting with the NES and then moving on to the later consoles. So it wouldn't be a surprise to me that later this holiday, when the SNES Mini is out, again, don't be surprised, I don't expect Super Nintendo games to be on there yet. That's just straight up business 101, not having two of your products conflict. So sorry about that long story. I've been wanting to say that for a while, and I think it's relevant for the conversation. So what does this mean for this year? Again, I think Nintendo knows that people are going to want these things. It's not going to be like last year where there was all this negativity. Also, they can listen to the problems from the NES Classic and try to fix them. Already there's reports that the controller cable is longer, and an extra controller is included out of the box. I mean, those should have been obvious, so I guess we shouldn't be exactly praising them for fixing those. So what will the demand be like? I'm going to tell you now. I still think these are going to be hard to find. Again, I think this is another limited engagement, just to kind of pass the time during the holidays and repeat on last year's success. I think there's going to be even more people trying to resell this time since they already know about last year, which is definitely going to complicate things. So my advice to you is to decide early if you want one. And if you do, put the effort in before November. This is something you don't want to put off until the holidays. Don't be lazy and put this off and go, I'll get one when I come across one. Again, decide now. This is either something you want or something you don't. Don't decide later that you want one because you see everybody else getting one. Also, I'd recommend following some of those Twitter accounts that specifically deal in these types of things. Get your phone in order and get your app game up, because it's possible you might have to buy these things on the fly. And finally, good luck and God be with you. We'll see you out there on the front lines. Thanks for listening. I almost forgot. I told you guys I had a little bit of hope for you, right? So I don't know how much hope this actually can be. This is just kind of my thoughts, and maybe how I would logically look at the situation if I were Nintendo. So last year when the NES Classic was consistently selling out, and people were griping about the cord length and other obvious problems, there was this general consensus of thought of, well, why doesn't Nintendo just fix these? Well, we didn't know at the time, but this was because the product was only for a limited time. But who's to say that they could never bring it back again? If I were Nintendo and I saw this money left on the counter, not spent because we sold out of product, and I felt that there was still a market for it, I would find a way to capitalize on that. So I think that's a possibility. Possibly a relaunch of the NES Classic. With 2 controllers and a longer cord, a better production run, and maybe some more games. I think if you look back on it, the NES Classic was maybe a little bit underpriced. Especially if you look at how much people are willing to pay for the resale market. So again, who's to say they wouldn't re-release it in a new package? Maybe even in top loader form. But maybe you're asking, well, why wouldn't they just do that now? Well, one thing, they already had their timeline set. I think they planned out this NES, SNES staggered launch to coincide with the Switch release and Virtual Console release. And also, I think that if they did release the NES Classic, they would obviously fix the oversights from the original. But it wouldn't make sense to do that right now, to re-release a console that you just sold 2 million units of, and leave all those people on the fuck you train by releasing a console that addressed issues that their console had. I mean, you would basically have just left all of those people in the dark. So not only would you have just alienated all the people who couldn't get a Classic, you successfully have just alienated everyone who did buy one too. So I think this is a case that maybe around E3 next year, we could see a relaunching of the NES Classic. Because I don't think the next step is a Nintendo 64 Mini, right? Because it doesn't make sense to try to recreate that experience, especially with that controller, and the prices for those games. So around this time next year, it'll have given sufficient time for the NES Classic to be out of date. And like Apple, Nintendo likes to do these annual releases, or re-updates of their portables. So I wouldn't go out and spend $400 on a resell Classic right now. I'd either recommend a Switch with the Virtual Console or wait it out till next year and see what happens. I hope that I'm right and that everybody can finally get their NES Classic. Thanks for listening. We'll see you later.